Hey folks, don't got a quote for the top of the episode today because there's going to be some shameless self promotion, which I think is probably fine. This is a free podcast, so it is what it is. I have mentioned that I've got a book coming out. Pre orders are opening next week. Yes, Jacob Dallas Main's They Called Her Rebel is officially going live with pre orders next week. The link will be in the episode description below. And I'm going to continue to be really annoying about this. I did my best to hopefully it stays reasonably priced. I asked for that. If I could make it free, I would. Don't tell my publisher I said that. But I sincerely hope everybody enjoys it, and it's been a labor of love. So super excited about that, and super excited for today's episode. So, Lenore, do you have a riff to go into the music, or are we just gonna hit it?
No, I think you summed it up. Welcome to the self-promotion shelf.
You're now listening to Socialist Shelf Radio.
Welcome once again to the Socialist Shelf. We are doing something, not different at all. We've been on a really, really strong nonfiction streak, a really strong interview streak. Tonight we have Jason and Ankita from Resistance Cinema here in Atlanta, and also from the podcasting scene as well. Jason, you've got Cold War Cinema, which I was just listening to on the way home, and Ankita, you've got Daisy Gaze. Both about radical cinema, yours specifically, Ankita, about radical Indian cinema, and we are excited to unpack it.
Very excited to be here. Thanks a lot for the invite. I think it's going to be a good discussion. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, so we've met each other just in the course of local, like Atlanta activism. We've run into each other, Palestine protests, that sort of thing, and also through Instagram. And I really just want to talk about, we talk about books mostly on here. Me and Lenore are both huge literature nerds, but there's a whole other side of, radical art. I mean, there's many other sides of it. And radical cinema is something that we're very interested in and something that we wanted to discuss. And it's, y'all have been bringing that to the people through your project. We wanted to talk about it and talk about its impact on the movement. So either or both of y'all, could you tell us what Resistance Cinema ATL is? So the folks know, and so people can, learn from it, duplicate it. Hopefully, let's have a Resistance Cinema everywhere, huh?
Agreed. Every city needs one.
Jason, do you want me to introduce it?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Resistance Cinema is a film collective. But it's not just any film collective. It's a very education-based film collective. We both are educators. I myself teach post-colonialism, colonialism, duh. And I think after October 7 happened, something shifted in both of us. Because I was also reading Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress, and I'm like, we need to do something with this. Like, our major aim was just to raise consciousness through cinema. So we think of Resistance Cinema as this educational project via film, influenced by other radical film collectives around the world, but also partly influenced by the Senegalese filmmaker Ousmane Sembene, who called his films kind of like night school, where he will just go around and show his films to his community and have discussions. So we generally screen a movie at the end of every month, sometimes more than once a month, and they are free screenings. Everybody is welcome. We watch the film sometimes, and mostly we have discussions after the films, and sometimes we do teach-ins. Jason, would you say that's fairly correct?
Yeah. Yes. And I would say probably 75% of the films we've shown have been documentaries, but we definitely sprinkle in narrative scripted films too. And usually they're feature length, but when we've done 2 or 3 teach-ins, we've done shorter films, like 30-minute long films. We did one on the Cop City situation, and some movement people came and talked about, gave people an update. That was last year. We did one about the situation in Kashmir, which was also last year before this recent flare up that happened there. And we're going to do one soon about the just horrendous situation in the Congo and the way that U.S. imperialism is driving that disaster. And we're going to collaborate with Black Alliance for Peace and Friends of the Congo and show a 25-minute documentary and then have kind of a panel discussion. So we do both of that model and then just regular film screening, and then circle up and discuss the themes and discuss how they can apply to our situation
Right.
here in Atlanta. So we see it as educational, but also a springboard for activism.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. I actually loved I read an article of yours, Jason, that I'll definitely link also in the show notes. It's gonna be show notes heavy episode, is what it is. That's y'all's reading for the week, not the book. It's the reading of the show notes. But there's an article where you talk about this inspiration, this filmmaker Simbene, and it quote I wanted to read from that because I really found this to be remarkable. It says, and this is after his films have been banned from theaters and whatnot by its government. Not to be dissuaded, Simbene showed his films anyway. He drove around the Senegalese countryside with a projector in tow, setting up screenings and back rooms for groups of villagers keen to learn and discuss these forbidden topics. He called these events night school. They challenged patriarchy, critiqued Senegal's political elite, sought to raise class consciousness, and unashamedly defended the notion that there was a cosmopolitan and pluralist culture indigenous to Africa. I love that as like a quick summary there, but I also love this idea of, even when it's banned, you can kind of take it on the road. There's a cool artistic element to that, of course, too, of this kind of, underground cinema. Like that's fun and cool, but also just it being as a tool for struggle. And also that for a working class, obviously very different conditions here in the United States, but class that sometimes has trouble engaging with longer texts, sometimes has difficulty or time issues or whatnot to sit down and read theory or whatnot. Not that we don't encourage that. Film can be a great entryway, a great educational tool, and it certainly can move people in really remarkable ways. I would say, I myself was greatly impacted by, for sure, coming to terms with my identity as a queer person, like queer cinema and things like that. And revolutionary cinema can have the exact same effect on people, the exact same agitation.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well the degree to which certain dissents are tolerated, depending on the target, of course, depending on the content. Like, because Sembene was fine up until he started, when he's being anti-colonial, when he's specifically targeting the French occupation, that's one thing. But once he turns on what he calls the native elite, you point out here, that's when the government bans his films. I couldn't help but think of, what we just read about in like Cop City, right? The Atlanta way, when that is targeted, when our specific ruling class and its malfeasance is targeted, that's when suddenly people get they get real defensive. Do you know what the nature of the ban was, out of curiosity? Was he just not allowed to, like, would theaters not distribute it, or were like the films themselves, would that get you door knocked?
I think, well, there was no distribution, so they were illegal to show in like a proper cinema. Um, I don't know how he managed to make them actually in that environment. His original production was, so he went to the Soviet Union and he took up basically a free film school because he was a member of the Communist Party and they invited him. He was a well-known author, by the way. He published a lot of novels, so he was known worldwide for his literature. And he said, "I want to get into filmmaking uh, because I think I can reach my people and better." And then he was invited to Moscow. They gave him a camera. They gave him basically a crash course in filmmaking, editing, and so forth. And he brought that camera back, and I assume they gave him some, actual film. I don't know exactly, but I don't know how he financed and produced them after it was banned. I'm not sure, but I know this, that they were celebrated at film festivals in Europe. So they were produced and made under that. I think the distribution was the ban, maybe just the screening, but he didn't care, so he just did it kind of guerrilla style.
I'm curious to ask. This gets very broad, but it's interesting. We've talked endlessly about the role of literature in radical movements, and we'll continue to do that. But I'm curious for y'all, what is this is so broad, but what is the role of cinema in radical movements? What do you see as that relationship? And what is something that you want people to take away to think about? I know y'all both have podcasts where I'm sure you've gone on about this at some length, and we encourage people to check that out. But I would be curious to hear y'all as cinema people, because I admittedly am not, talk about the relationship between cinema and movements and that dialectic in general.
I will start with what radicalized me. I was born and brought up in Bihar, in India, a very, one of the richest regions pre colonially. And when I was born, it was completely backward, forgotten, underdeveloped. And I was born in an educational system which was not up to the mark. So when I moved, for example, from Bihar, that's the state I was born into, to like the metropolitan city, New Delhi, I could have very well moved to New York. It was so much different. Um, but for me, even if, let's say, the books were not there to radicalize me, the films arrived before. So I remember just engaging with regional history and regional films. And for me, films through their radicalization arrived first, and then came the literature, because English is my second language. So, and that was when I realized that, wow, films just in their visual medium. So in literature, for example, you're reading a book, you really have to visualize the character, the setting, and everything. And film as a visual medium brings all of it together. And let's also face it, right now, I teach and my students have a very less attention span. So if I give them like a 30-page essay, they're like, really, we have to do that? But whenever I tell them to watch a movie, they're like, oh, yeah, more movies. And I think we have potentially, we discussed, I was like, we should do this before. Jason had already done film collectives before, film screenings before. So, and, let me be very honest. When it comes to masses, not everybody likes to read, knows where to access reading. So we really wanted to create a space where everybody can be allowed and can become a part of this collective, where you are watching something and then simply deconstructing and decoding it together in a group, without any elitism of PhDs or anything, like beyond institutional boundaries. And that's what I'll say. That's why we began this collective, because we really wanted people to have access to an education that we can say that education for all, but via films. But also, we run an anti-imperialist book club now, so I think Jason can speak more to that on that.
Yeah, I would say too, it's worth noting that the October Revolution, roughly 70% of the Russian population was illiterate. And clearly they knew something, right? Not that literacy and writing and education didn't play a massive role, but there had to be ways of getting around a lot of that under education. Not to say that, the immediate campaigns should not be for literacy and things like that. But you look at a lot of colonial projects that have fought back against their oppressors, where the people are very, very educated. Famously, Ho Chi Minh saying a 16-year-old understands our army understands dialectics better than a Marxist professor in the United States. And prior to their involvement in the Communist Party, a lot of them couldn't read. So I think that's very important. Where can we reach people? How can we engage with them? And film, everybody likes a movie.
Can I just add something to it really quick? Actually, when Hindi cinema is known as Bollywood, one of the many film industries in India, folks, so it's not everything. And actually, it was very interesting that you have to understand that that film industry emerged during the British colonial period. And when it was emerging, the technology arrived, and when people like, let's make movies, that was a motivation behind it. That, hey, through this medium we can reach out to more people, because there were like limitations on what can be written, what can be published. So early Indian cinema was silent, very devotional in nature. But how they radicalized people, because that was the first time we were showing our culture. We were making movies for the consumption of our own people. And then, well, independence happened, Britishers got kicked out, and Bollywood is one of the biggest film industries. But yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I wanted to add too that um, during the big protest movements of the '60s, well, let's take it back for a second to Russia. So you mentioned 70% illiteracy rate. The early Soviet filmmakers like Sergei Eisenstein and some of the others, they were very aware of using cinema as a teaching tool for dialectical materialism. And they actually took the idea of what they call Soviet montage. So Soviet montage is this film editing technique that's just pervasive. This is just what people do these days. But you put things in a sequence and people are able to interpret the full meaning of, oh, this thing comes and then this other thing that's different, and oh, I see a story emerging from that. So they were trying to teach the masses both what is the dialectic and how does that help us apprehend our social environment or social realities, but also let's make revolutionary films that are very much both promoting socialism and these sort of things, and then condemning like capitalism and greed and imperialism and so forth. So that was part of their revolutionary project. But jumping ahead to the 60s, all over the world, you had anti imperialist and socialist cinema worldwide. But here in the US, you had a film collective called the Newsreel, and they would make these short, basically agitprop films about the Black Panther movement, about protests again, about Palestine, about whatever. And these are really fascinating films. And one of them was made about the occupation of Colombia, and whenever Colombia was occupied again during the encampment, revolt that happened last year, they screened that movie. They screened that newsreel thing from '68 that was showing the exact same buildings that they were looking at, 50 years later or 60 years later, I guess. But I think that when the Occupy movement kicked off, I was pretty involved in St. Louis, where I was living at the time, and we took a billboard tarp, like a huge billboard, and we flipped it over, and the back was just white, and we kind of lashed this to two poles where the occupation was, or the encampment was, and I bought a projector and I bought a big a portable speaker, and I showed 3 films a week during the Occupy movement in St. Louis, and people loved it. We showed Battle of Algiers, we showed, V for Vendetta, these sorts of things that got people excited, that got people energized about rebellion, and it was a real great addition to, because that's what these films do. They both teach, but they also help you reaffirm your commitment to the struggle, because you're like, wow, these people are risking life and death. I can at least take a few minor risks for whatever I'm doing right now. So it's pretty inspiring, I think.
I think that legacy of the movement is super important too. I think it was an underdiscussed part of the Columbia encampments was the history of that at the college, and it's underdiscussed. Why? Because then you would get into the fact that the students were right the last time it happened, right? So I think that film, that record of it, both as a historical thing and to learn from it, because students were actively watching that, like, oh, look, they did that. That seems to be effective. Turns out it is. And it's it bears bringing up. I believe we mentioned it on another episode, just out of frustration. UCLA was breaking up film screenings of films like The Encampments and Gaza Fights for Freedom and things like that. I mean, police literally breaking up students trying to watch these films on the green just a few weeks ago. So this is, an active struggle. You want to talk about, repression in these other countries. Of course, censorship absolutely could get a lot worse. It has been worse in this country in the past, and it very well could be again before we get through this thing. But, it's worth noting that there are efforts to, repress this radical cinema to this day. Um, I was gonna ask, or not ask. I was gonna say, is that movie Strike an Eisenstein movie? That
Yeah.
1920
Yes.
something?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I watched that in a film class in college. I just remember
Nice.
a bunch of people not really wanting to watch the movie, and then we watched it, and a lot of people got into it by the end of it.
Nice.
That being really cool. So,
Yeah, the early Soviet silent cinema is really cool. There's several fantastic filmmakers. Ziga Vertov is another one. He made Man with a Movie Camera. These really kind of avant-garde Soviet films are cool, worth watching.
Well, yeah, and it's worth noting that like with the in conversation with the ongoing repression of cultural expression, anti-imperialist expression, in the form of breaking up the student encampments and whatnot. There's a very, and you point this out toward the end of the article. There's a definite upswing in anti-imperialist organizing that greatly resembles 1968. And you mentioned this in the context of 1973's The Spook Who Sat by the Door, which just got restored in 4K last year. And what you say here, police brutality is still central to the discourse. This year's DNC was held in Chicago, just like in 1968. Student protests have been violently quelled. You don't have to look very far to see these things still being discussed. Certainly.
Yeah, good point. I think last year people were drawing a lot of parallels between 68. I mean, we had a genocidal Democrat in office, and we did also in 68. Yeah, it's
Chicago
frustrating.
DNC. There are a number of things going on.
Well,
Yeah,
ask the rest of the world. We have been very clear on Democrats.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, both are imperialist parties.
Oh yeah. Well, and it's interesting as well in conversation with the sorts of movies that I mean, of course, V for Vendetta, right? It's a big budget Hollywood film. Does it have revolutionary themes? Sure. Is it at a far enough remove from what's going on today? Arguably, the movie had a little more in common with the Bush era rather than the Thatcher era, but it's there's only so much you can get from a Hollywood adaptation. I'm
Before we
think
get
Mhm.
back into substance really quick, I just
Yeah.
have to add, when I saw some graffiti the other day that was just the V for Vendetta mask, and it had a quote bubble, and it was just saying V for Vendetta, and I thought that was the funniest. Like, he's just saying V for Vendetta, the guy. I don't I don't know why, but that tickled me when I saw that. So I had to throw
just
that
just
out
in
there
case you
while.
forgot what it stood for.
Yeah, I love when he stood up and said V for Vendetta in that
Mhm.
movie. That was
But
really
even
cool.
but even so, like you have movies within the acceptable limits of discourse that can nevertheless be used as a gateway, depending on the context in which they're shown. I'm thinking right now, this is way back, but like Jacob, you remember when we were discussing movies with like Vijay Prashad, and we brought up like Black Klansman, right, and how it's I couldn't help but think of that in the context of the movie you mentioned, Jason, Spook Us Out by the Door, because it's sort of an inverse, right? You have a I don't know about an inverse, but it's a similar structure, right? You have in Black Klansman the first black detective in the Colorado Springs police force who infiltrates the Klan and breaks it up, and while the movie, I'd argue, has some interesting stuff to say about how white supremacy manifests in this country, culturally, there is definitely sort of a pro-cop, bent to it nonetheless. Famously, Alec Karakatsanis, big fan of his work and all the work he does for police and prisons, exposing that. He hates the film. He says it's um, when it comes to what is to be done in regards to our carceral state, not a lot of great things to say. And so I wonder, in that context, because I haven't seen The Spook Is Sat by the Door. It's sort of the inverse. You got a black CIA agent who's trying to infiltrate and break up this Black Panther cell. What's sort of the trajectory there in terms of what it prescribes for the audience?
Oh, it prescribed armed struggle. I mean, it's a
Hmm.
straight up revolutionary film. I mean, they this underground Black liberation group movement or group. It's kind of like the Black Liberation Army, something like that. They essentially like they like break into a police facility and expropriate a bunch of weaponry and just like unleash. It's full on. I mean, it's full on revolutionary
The
film.
George Jackson type shit for sure.
Yeah, yeah, like unapologetically. He got away with it because basically he just kind of, well, there was no oversight, and they pulled it from theaters pretty quickly because the company was like wanting to do a black exploitation kind of film, and he's like, I'm going to take my opportunity here to do something revolutionary, and they pulled it from theaters.
And specifically, the black exploitation angle was to get around like more strict regulations on like white coded films. You mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, they saw another market. This is
Mm.
when they were like, "Oh, there's a new emerging market here," and that's the heyday of the black exploitation kind of crime films.
Well,
That
thank God the Hollywood stopped trying to pander to different demographics just to make a quick buck. I can't imagine. To go back to talking more about resistance cinema, I'm curious. Y'all have done a number of movies and other films. I'm curious about your process. What causes you to pick out a film in particular, and then what is your process for discussion around it? What do you find to be constructive? What have you learned through that process? That's both just kind of interesting to me, and also I think for anyone who's trying to do that, even if they're not trying to make a full organization, even if they're just trying to invite over some friends, talk about a radical film. Um, what have you learned? How do you pick them? And how do you talk about them?
I mean, let me be very honest. Jason has incredible amount of list already ready what he wants to show for like the next 20 years, if I'm being honest.
Fantastic.
Uh, so, and well, fortunately, or I think super fortunately, we are married. So he always, the first step is like, hey, these are some of the ideas I have. Then if something is on my mind and we share it with our third very crucial core member, Fig, and we go through on the chat of what we are thinking, and we very unanimously decide on a film, thinking about what themes we have not shown yet. If it's like a, for example, Mother's Day, so is there something around that, or like Women's Day, so can we do something like a revolutionary women's story? So it's a lot of discussion. We really start planning way ahead, and then we start, Fig designs the flyers. Fig would say they are the flyer guy. I disagree. I think they're the brains behind Resistance Cinema on promotion and everything. And once the flyer is
The
out,
flyers are cool, by the way. The flyers look good.
yeah, it's all fake. So, so yeah, and that's how we decide that what films we want to show. Now, sometimes if I'm like, hey, can we do a South Asian special month, or you know, uh, like for example, now I'm also like, hey, why don't we show like a very Bollywood narrative queer drama, because that's resistance in itself. So it's always discussion based, and it's a very chill process to kind of decide. And once we show the movie, we take a 5-10 minute break, and we are like, okay guys, you're welcome to stay back, or we understand if you want to leave. Generally people stay back, and we generally start with like, okay, first impressions, what stood out to you, do you have any questions? And then it just very organically flows. And we always try to really think about, when we are watching a film, resistance, struggle, how it is different or similar in our current time. For example, one of the discussions that often comes forward is like, the U.S. state is ridiculously strong, right? So, what does revolution or resistance look like when you have such a repressive state or an oppressive state? Like, what is the difference between, let's say, when Algerians were fighting for their independence, and let's say if there are decolonial processes today in 2025 when so many states and nations are nuclearized. So something like that. We really kind of sit with that, discuss, and I think that's what we do. Jason, you want to add something?
No, that's right. I mean, we try to our mission is to promote films, to shine a light on anti-imperialist struggles around the world, anti-capitalist struggles and just social movement. So we want to bring in a historical scope. We want to show people. So like last year in August for Black August, we showed a film about Fred Hampton, which someone came in and said a few words about the Black liberation movement in the 60s and 70s who knew a lot about it. And there's a lot of parallels, like we were just talking about, between those times and the current era. And so there are really like key things that we can take from that. But also, I want people to know about the Black Panther Party, the
Right.
Right.
actual. So it's important for them to know radical history also. And things like that. I mean, yeah. So we're trying to cover a lot of things, and it's just a matter of time. I mean, we're not going to stop, so we'll just keep going and keep showing new things.
I think one of the major takeaways has been just watching and learning that, however, struggles are unique but also connected, and that's very important if you want to foster a global anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, anti-imperial, mass consciousness. That you really have to understand that the mechanisms of oppression have been very similar. Okay, and even though resistance is also similar, but also it's very unique, each according to its own space. And another major takeaway, I think, is to really kind of sit when you watch a movie like Battle of Algiers, which was our first screening, that, okay, what does resistance look like? Like resistance is not something that I'm not going to have a coffee with, let's say, Robert Clive and be like, hey dude, you want to leave India now in peace? So that's not going to happen. Right?
Right.
Because unless the imperialists or colonialists think that there are material repercussions, there are material disadvantages of them continuing their empire, they're not going to change. And you have to understand, India got its independence because after 1945, World War II, the Britishers lost a lot, and they were like, okay, we can't really maintain the empire. So that was happening, but also there were Marxist communist fighters like Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev, Rajguru, who were like, no, we are going to do armed rebellion, and we are going to show these Britishers that we can learn their mechanism, right? We can learn their mechanism and we can develop our own resistance. So what I'm trying to say is, like, I mean, we are also trying uh, to really have people sit with this discomforts. When you see an FLN revolutionary, killing a French colonial officer, okay, and you're like, wow, that was violent. Okay, but what about the tanks and everything the French colonizers bring? So one of the things we really want people to understand, that we always make concessions for state legitimized violence, and somehow when oppressed people are fighting, we very quickly moralize it. And that is a central contradiction we not only want to sit with, but we also want to understand that, you know, uh, don't let people like Fred Hampton scare you. You have to really understand their mechanisms and why they were forced into that. So, I mean, and, this is, I think, Jason, that's what I would like to say, that major
I-
contradictions.
I'd say if you're the type of person that needs to be afraid of Fred Hampton, you're not the type of person I want to be around in the first place.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Don't worry, 99% of us don't need to be
Exactly.
afraid of him. And there's 1% that
Exactly.
need to be very afraid. And that's where we need to be at. I
Exactly.
find a great quote. This is obviously not a filmmaker, but the writer, Mark Twain, who miraculously we have still not covered on this show after 100 episodes. Um, but said that there were two reigns of terror, right? When he's talking about the French Revolution, he said there was the like 2 month reign of terror that we talk about forever and ever. And then there's the 1,000 year reign of terror. That is every single day, every single poor person. And film, books can display that in its own
Mhm.
certain way and it reaches it. But film can show it in a very visceral, very
Yeah.
in your face fashion. It can be realistic, it can be stylistic, it can be a documentary that's just straight up like, look, you have to sit with this. And that's something that remains, remarkably effective. I remember watching the documentary, The Murder of Fred Hampton, fully knowing the story, knowing pretty much every detail of the story, and just it like hitting you so hard. And I guarantee you, I've seen it like 2 or 3 times now. I guarantee if I saw it again, it would still make me tear up, because we should feel that. We should feel that as
That's the
revolutionary.
one we showed. That's a masterpiece of documentary
Mm.
filmmaking, in my
And
opinion.
so
It's just
soon after his death, too. It was only
right,
a few
right.
years.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's the one we showed. It's great.
It's a fantastic one. No, and what you say, Ankita, about um, showing the way that violence from colonizers and violence from colonized people is equated. I mean, Battle for Algiers is a really good movie to introduce that subject, because it very consciously cuts against a recurring theme, particularly in like Marvel, like, you know, your Black Panther sort of milieu, which is that, oh, like, that this idea that billions of dollars go into, culturally speaking, that somehow colonized people and oppressed people are capable of violence on a level anywhere resembling the colonizer, the oppressor, and that like somehow like any victory on their part would be equally bad. And in order to do that, you have to retreat into realms of pure fantasy, you know, where there is a Wakanda that can enact that on the world. Of course, you know, realistically, there's not. And yeah, Jacob, you're absolutely right. You know, Mark Twain sums that up pretty well. So does C.L.R. James, incidentally, in Black Jacobins. You know, when you know he doesn't shy away from the violence of the formerly enslaved Haitians that they visit on the French, and he sums it up with, "And yet they were moderate." You know, it's an upsurge in revolutionary violence is a it's a momentary passion quickly sated, as opposed to, you know, the everyday perpetuation of a regime of brutality, you know. And it's much easier to show it in a film like Battle for Algiers than in a relatively sanitized production, even like Black Panther, you know, as much fighting as there is
Mhm.
in that.
In fact, like I
Here
think,
are sorry, really quick. Here are VJ Prashad episode if you want to hear him talk shit about like Black Panther, and The Flash, and quite the opposite of the type of films we're talking about now. He had a lot to say about The Flash. Shockingly amount for one of the best Marxist intellectuals out there. Is
Yeah,
hilarious. It's great. I'm
we're
sorry. Go ahead,
reading.
Ankita.
Oh, go ahead.
oh no, I was just gonna say, like, I think recently Jason and I watched Sembene's movie Emitai, and that literally, that is also a movie that shows you that the difference between the mechanisms of violence. And as Franz Fanon has said, like, when you reduce a group of people, when you depersonalize them, when you reduce them to nothing but violate it, that's the language they speak. The colonizer brought the appetite for violence to my territory. Okay, and you reduced us, you put us in zoos all around Europe. And so when you have animalized us, when you have completely depersonalized us to this level, so you know, throwing a stone and on a tank is not equal as throwing 2,000 pounds of bomb on a child.
Precisely.
I want to go in a direction. You know, we're talking about what radical cinema shows. It shows that, you know, inequality of that violence. It shows us that you know, what revolutionary struggle looks like. I'm curious, and this is something that could be discussed endlessly, and it also has to do with culture. What is the on like the technical level on what a movie looks like? I'm curious, are there any hallmarks you feel of like radical cinema? And I know different traditions, different times of Soviet films are going to look different than a Cuban film, than an Angolan film, and so on, or an Indian film. Uh, but if you have any thoughts on that, or how that comes out in styles, or even particular artist styles, you know, I would be, you know, remiss not to ask about the technical aspect, because just something that we don't get to talk about a lot on the show, and I would love if y'all had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and particularly in conversation with like the environment in which they get made. I know you mentioned in the article, Jason, that like Yugoslavia had a more open importation culture around their film industry than like the Soviet Union. So you know, how does that sort of shake out one way or another?
Just really quick, Lenore, when I was in former Yugoslavia a few weeks ago, in Croatia, I overheard an old man say, "Movies suck now," and I do wonder if he was referring to that period or what period he was referring to. I found it to be very funny. He may have also just been talking about movies from like 2005, but I remember "movies suck now" connecting to this article in a very funny way.
I mean, most movies do suck for sure. You have, but there's some good ones out there. I will say so. The question you ask is not easy to answer, and there's a landmark essay which I think I mentioned in that article called "Tour de Third Cinema," which appeared in 1968 by two Argentinian filmmakers and Marxists. Octavio Hetino and Fernando Solanas. And they basically lay out a theory for how to think about radical cinema and its role in revolutionary movements at the time in 1968. And they very clearly, pose some of these questions, and they say, it's kind of like the question, how do you use the tools of the oppressor to attack them, and that sort of thing. And it gets into aesthetics. So maybe I could just read this quote.
Please.
So he says, and actually throughout this whole essay, they circle around this question of what are the aesthetic forms that a revolutionary Marxist should enact when they're creating radical cinema, and as a way to avoid replicating bourgeois values, bourgeois structures, and so forth. But there's several good quotes in this, but this is one that I thought was interesting. He says, the models of production, distribution, and exhibition continue to be those of Hollywood. He's talking about, or they're talking about, in recent times, because in ideology and politics, films had not yet become the vehicle for a clearly drawn differentiation between bourgeois ideology and politics, a reformist policy as manifested in dialogue with the adversary, in coexistence, and in the relegation of national contradictions to those between two supposedly unique blocs, the USSR and the USA, was and is unable to produce anything but a cinema with a system within the system itself. At best, it can be the quote progressive wing of establishment cinema. When all is said and done, such cinema was doomed to wait until the world conflict was resolved peacefully in favor of socialism in order to change qualitatively. The most daring attempts of those filmmakers who strove to conquer the fortress of official cinema ended, as Jean-Luc Godard eloquently put it, with the filmmakers themselves, quote, trapped inside the fortress. And it goes on, but basically it's posing this question that doesn't really come up with a perfect answer, which is how do you remake these radical forces? And what's really crazy, or what's really interesting, is these Soviet filmmakers were really, I mean, they really were remaking the means of making cinema in the 20s, 1920s, way before this was written. But as cinema became this more established commercial product, it was hard to avoid narrative structures and other techniques. Godard was giving it his best shot among, and quite a few of these radical filmmakers. One of the filmmakers who was making revolutionary films was Costa Gavras, who is a French Greek director. He made a film called Z, just the letter Z or Z, and he made one called State of Siege, that are very much critiquing Western imperialism and fascism. But he was criticized because he was replicating the thriller structure of Hollywood, and the real hardcore Marxists in France and all these other places were like, "Hey, do something more like Godard, something radical, or Chris Marker, or one of these radical experimentalist types." And so the debate has never been settled. That's what I would say. Ankita, do you want to add anything to that?
I don't know if this is like a common aesthetical choice I have noticed. Like when I go back to films like Battle of Algiers or the Hindi film Mirch Masala, I think the setting in itself becomes a character. So, something I have noticed in such revolutionary socialist films that it is very important that the spaces where they are shooting in itself become a character. And so, like the hidden spaces in the Kasbah or in the Mirch Masala, where these women who work at the chili pepper factory, and that factory in itself becomes a space for rebellion, something that I've covered in my podcast too. I don't know, like I thought on top of my head, that is something I have noticed. But also coming to Mirch Masala, which is a 1987 Hindi film made by the Gujarati director Ketan Mehta. When I was studying his biography, and when I have studied socialist cinema through India, the very common thing I've noticed, that all of these directors, filmmakers were a part of theater associations and Communist Party of India. So they were very much involved in learning and understanding revolutionary politics, and then also carry revolutionary storytelling. So, for example, Ketan Mehta would travel all around the villages in Gujarat, hear the stories from people. Then he made a Mirch Masala, or his Gujarati film, which is Bhavni Bhavai, which is just brilliant. It involves Gujarati folktale with anti-caste elements. So that is something I have studied, that how these actors, some of the very famous Marxist actors like Balraj Sahani, Prithviraj Kapoor, they were very much a part of the theatre association and also socialist political parties.
Hmm.
So I don't know if that helps with revolutionary cinema, but as I'm digging more, that I'm noticing these common threads between them.
That's interesting because we have like, in the West at the very least, this kind of idea, this like auteur theory of like how film works. And it's not to say that there aren't remarkable individuals out there with remarkable contributions that are outsized. But of course, especially with the movie, unless it's just a very, very particular type of movie, it's a collaborative project. And the more individual you make a movie, the more it is about that person and their like vision that just comes out of nowhere. It's just their own brain. Sometimes you'll get something interesting, but something politically grounded, something that is driving you in a direction that is motivational. It's so important that these people were grounded in their communities, in their countries, in their parties, in their organizations, that in education, right, that they are collecting from other people, and then they are making this a project that they're putting. You can think about the alternative, which is very much a person that is above any kind of criticism, that is and whatnot, who really doesn't want any kind of input, and maybe they'll make something kind of interesting to watch. But even then, it's not by yourself. James Cameron or whoever is not conjuring a film into existence. It is a
Right. Right,
collaborative.
exactly.
Mhm.
And that is actually just a major difference in Bollywood. Like, one of the things we always discuss is like how the Hollywood studio system completely damaged Bollywood filmmaking. Because when it comes to Bollywood filmmaking, it has always been a collective process. If you look at directors, Yash Chopra, they would always say, no, it's a family thing. We get together, we eat together. Nobody will have a script. Do you know that in early Hindi films, they were like, actors are not coming prepared, and they were like, well, this is the scene and let's make up the dialogue as we go. So, and I'm a
Wow.
big fan of that. I'm a big fan of that. Like, there were some very what people would say bad horror movies in Bollywood are some of my favorites. There is a remake, or as they would say, they would say copy of Nightmare on the Elm Street in Bollywood. And how this was made, these were Pakistani immigrants in India. They had an electrical shop. They got very fascinated by some Hollywood film they saw. And then these brothers, Ramsey brothers, they were like, let's make movies. But, funding is a big part. So they will just rent a truck. They would go to this abandoned colonial mansion on the city outskirts. They will have all the actors and families pooled together. That, okay, costumes, bring whatever costumes you have. Okay, my mom is going to make meal. And they will like make movies in 45 days. Yeah, they are maybe bad, but again, I always think about what constitutes bad, like how much I have been very much thinking through a very bourgeois lens of aesthetical theory of cinema, but they were also very radical in itself. And I mean, this is how we made films, seriously. Even like beyond Bollywood, like Satyajit Ray, he would really scan out the spaces, the people he wants to cast in his movies, non-actors and things like that, which completely changed because now you have the studio system. So the studio decides what kind of movies you're going to make. Then you have the Bollywood stardom. We need to have only this actor, and hence we are churning out absolutely pro right-wing propaganda. So
Mm.
there's that.
Yeah, it's I'll say this, bad, good, whatever you want to call it. I'll watch that all day before I watch like some AI generated or
Oh,
over
100,
something
100%.
like that. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? But which is what they seem, the Hollywood studio system wants seems to want to move towards anyway.
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely.
just complete slop. I'd rather there be a human hands and human hearts and thoughts, and I think there's something very freeing about, cinema in the way of like, people, even if they're not making political art in quotations, um, interacting with other art, even if it's like, Nightmare on Elm Street, and being inspired by that just as people and feeling like they have the power to do that. And when I think about an ideal society, I think about like people at many levels, especially artistically, feeling that power, like they can take it in their own hands. And yeah, maybe it's a successful project, maybe it's a failed project, maybe in 100 years we'll look back and be like, that was genius and no one got it then. That's not even the point, and I find that to be remarkable, even on we won't call it a political level, but we'll call it on even if it's a horror movie, even if it's something silly. There's
Absolutely.
something very beautiful and powerful about that.
Yeah, agreed. A last thought I had to add to that question about aesthetics on radical films, any filmmaker, no matter who they are and where they're coming from ideologically, they have a choice to make in terms, and the same could be said for any author. um, what genre or whatever am I trying to work in? What story is it going to be? What am I going to emphasize? What am I going to, and like they've tried, there is an example of every type of genre and every type of aesthetic approach in radical cinema. And on one hand, we tend to forget, but they are artists also, right? They're not just they're not writing a propaganda essay. They're creating a work of visual art, and so they have to balance their aesthetic priorities with their other priorities if they're trying to make radical cinema. And traditionally, aside from the really avant-garde Soviet filmmakers, traditionally, I would say most left-wing socialist communist directors chose what's often called social realism. The Italian neorealist. They want to shine a light on the underclasses, on show what abject poverty looks like and who's responsible for it. So, one name that comes to mind is Vittorio De Sica. Vittorio De Sica made some fantastic films in Italy in the 40s and 50s. One of them is called Umberto D. He made The Bicycle Thieves, and he's trying to show the underclasses and celebrate their life, and also show how they're screwed over and over. But he was a member of the Italian Communist Party. He was his his brother-in-law was the person who assassinated Trotsky.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, his wife's brother was the guy. He's from Barcelona who traveled from Barcelona to Mexico City and put an ice pick into Trotsky's dome. But
Yeah.
anyway, interesting connection.
Just trying to watch the movie, and it's like, fun fact. And you're
Yeah,
watching.
yeah,
These
but
these these circles do lend themselves to a very small and strange world. Yeah.
yeah, but I'm a big fan of his films, and Bicycle Thieves is one. But he made a really underknown, fantastic movie called Shoe Shine, which is just about kids that are these kids that are caught up in the system. But that's a mode of filmmaking that you would often see of radical filmmakers: social realism. Let's shine a light on these oppressive systems and on capitalism and look at. But then you have people like Godard who are like, there's debate though, like, are you going to get who's watching these and what are they going to get out of it?
Sure.
And generally speaking, you can get more people to watch a drama than an avant-garde movie like a Godard film. And
Makes
so
sense.
that's like, who is this for? But there's a lot of things to weigh. And so I think it's fun whenever you see a more silly genre type of movie that's definitely trying to, critique our system, something like Sorry to Bother You.
Sure.
And that's
Hmm.
like, hey, let's have fun with a genre film and make it goofy, but also make it radical. And so people are trying to find ways to work within all of these parameters, less and less, but still it's happening
I think we have our own shoe shine, which is boot polish. I think we watched it together, Jason. And one thing I realized that,
in
um,
India. Yeah.
yeah, in India, that you really have to also understand that. how these different countries were kind of in communication with each other. They were following each other's socialist revolutionary film projects, right? And yeah, there has been a huge debate in Hindi cinema, like, oh my God, they just blatantly copy something from the West. Well, my whole theory is that the West took a lot from us, so they're gonna have it.
Yeah.
But anyway, but also it's like, just to complicate the whole theory of copying, that yeah, maybe they are copying, but the ideas are getting transported too. And you really have to understand that when it comes to, the production quality and filmmaking, uh, and why these directors are doing so, which is another conversation. So, what Jason said, like, something like you have to understand, like Bollywood genre does. So, if you look at their 80s angry young man trope or genre, those were very radical movies, but very genre action flicks. There is romance, there are 6 or 7 songs, but it is always this angry man against the system, who is like, no, I'm gonna turn it over, and he wins. So obviously it is melodrama, as people can say, but it is also showing you what is possible, because these filmmakers, I remember a filmmaker, Manmohan Desai, who was like, we want to make the masses happy. They have already, so much to think about, so much to bother for, and I want them to have fun. I want them to kind of entertain this idea of what can be possible. So there is a lot of things you can do with things like melodrama. So whenever people say, oh, Hindi films are very melodramatic and there are songs everywhere, then I'm like, yeah, listen to the songs, because the words are important. So when you will watch films like Balraj Sahani's, the Marxist actors films, they're like also like they're coming together enjoying a harvest season, but also you will be like, oh, they're also struggling with a famine. So, and I think that's important, because and that's why Bollywood in itself, in its very core, is a very rebellious film industry, because it's first of all, it is absolutely unique. There is nothing like it, with songs and everything, and it is going strong. Not right now, but we can talk about that later. But it is also like, we are going to stay true our aesthetics, and we are going to make a story we want to make. So that in itself is very rebellion. And then you bring in songs and dance, and they have showed, for a very long time, what you can do with songs and dances. And that's why they were very popular in Soviet Union. They were so popular that if anybody would criticize a film of the director, say Raj Kapoor, within the Russian film criticism, the editor will get death notes that, hey, you can't criticize this Indian film. So right. So I'm just saying that there is a lot of potential with these genres. Like, for example, we have now feminist horror films in Bollywood.
Mm,
Um, uh, you know, uh, yeah, joy and rebellion can coexist. Something I tell my husband all the time, right?
yeah. Uh,
That's
you know
that's
the
fascinating that these films, even during like the Soviet Union, even decades ago, like you have like shooters like sending death threats to people who like we
didn't
think of
start
that.
with Twitter. It's
Yeah,
always been
literally,
around.
yeah,
People
yeah.
have always been crazy fans.
We think that, we
And
think of this as a very online phenomenon, but like
exactly.
all that online does is put us in contact with with these people.
And
To a
also
greater
for
degree.
Indian movies, it's like, yeah, don't criticize Indian movies. Oh hell yeah, Russian Brotherhood is a whole thing.
Yeah. I, I find it yeah, no, it's interesting. I remember once talking about some Bollywood films and someone said, but they all have songs in them. I'm like, yeah, do you hate fun? They rule. Like it's
Yeah,
usually quite
but
good, you know?
the lyrics are important. Just focus
Yeah.
on the translated words. They are singing about taking ownership of the land or
Mhm.
kicking the Britishers' butt, which is also so
Mhm.
fantastic.
Yes. It's very much like, also to me, like, one thing I say to people, unless you have a very specific reason you can't, y'all got to be watching foreign movies. You can read the subtitles. I'm sorry. You can make it work. Rewind if you need to, but like, we got to be doing it. It's a 1 inch hurdle, it's,
Exactly.
people in other countries are watching English movies plenty.
Oh,
Yeah,
geez,
if you're not
yeah,
watching,
yeah,
if you're only
absolutely.
So,
watching American films, you're missing out. I'll
yeah.
I'm,
say
I'm,
that.
yeah, I'm very sorry, you guys. You have a lot of propaganda in the US,
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
whether it is films, whether it is education system, and the rest of the world has so much more to offer. You
Yeah.
watch kung fu movies and you realize they are radical as hell. So,
Mhm.
Yeah, please do that. Please, move beyond the US.
You also realize some of the best stuff in American movies is from foreign films that they did it first, and that's fine.
Totally.
In the same way, it's fine that it was brought over one way. It's fine to be, it's great that The Matrix brought over staples of like films from Hong Kong, but it should be noticed that they were doing it like 15 years before The Matrix came out.
Absolutely.
No hate to
Yeah,
The
at
Matrix. I
least.
love The Matrix.
You're right,
Uh,
right.
I find it interesting too. You're talking about Jason, about people trying to put that art in the film and that relate. Sometimes the difficulty of the relationship between that, the artistry, the enjoyment, and also the politics. I find it in American cinema very often what it ends up kind of being is sometimes it feeling kind of shoehorned or pushed in. But I do appreciate when um, artists can get it in there. But then sometimes it leads to, I don't know, like Adam McKay's The Other Guys, and then the credits are just about income inequality. And I'm like, that's true, but huh? Um, I do find it interesting. And we talk a lot about, on the show about the radical art and how art can transform people. And I was just thinking, and I know we're kind of coming to a close here, but this is a question that I wanted to get in. I think it's great for the end. Uh, Current Affairs just ran a really great article by R.S. Benedict about not expecting art to be the sole salvation, not as criticism of art, but as criticism of the idea that a cultural victory is tantamount to political victory. And it talks about, quote, as the right wing wins one political victory after another, artists rush to present themselves as the vanguard of resistance. This is nothing new. And then it says, art did not save them, referring to Weimar, Germany, or expressionist films. It will not save us. But that is not to say art is worthless. It has value for its own sake. It cannot topple fascism, but that is not art's job, nor should it be. To topple fascism is our job. Art's role in the struggle is to channel people towards collective action, not to act as a substitute for it. And I wanted to throw that out there as a note because I know I want our listeners to remember that. And I know that's something that you were both very well aware of. But I wanted that to be something you touched on. Art is a viable and amazing way of resistance, but is also a step in a broader frame of resistance. We were talking about the type of resistance it can depict and encourage earlier, but I wanted to know, y'all talk about the relationship of art to action, because I do think there can be a problem, and maybe especially in like consumerist societies, of feeling like I did my leftist activism for the day by watching a good movie, a movie with good politics. I watched Sorry to Bother You, so I did my union organizing. Obviously, that is not what y'all are doing with with Resistance Cinema. I'm curious to know, how do you push beyond those things and make art a liberatory tool?
There's a few things I'd say for about it. First, most of the films we've shown have been documentaries, and that's a little bit. They are aestheticized. They are,
Sure.
there is some interest in making it a interesting visual product, but the message is the main point in those. And so only a few of the documentaries we've shown would even dare to say I'm striving for art for this production. But on the other ones, yeah, it's a good question because we see it as is just a collective. It's like having a good conversation with a friend,
Mm.
and you get inspired, and you get challenged, and you come away and think, how am I going to generate these various thoughts into some kind of action? So it's a springboard into something else, and because it's a collective in-person experience, it becomes a little bit more. There's some energy in the room. People are excited to be experiencing the same thing in a dark room with a bright screen, among others. And then we get a chance to process it. So it isn't a substitute for action, but it is a springboard into action, I would say. Or could be. Ideally, it could be. And I've definitely seen like people getting more educated, more radicalized through coming to our screenings. And there's been friendships that have sparked from people who have come to our screenings, including us becoming friends with people who come a lot. We started a book club, an anti-imperialist book club. We're reading a Vijay Prashad book right now,
Oh, which one?
Darker Nations.
Hell yeah.
So this is our third book. We read um, Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism. Now we're on Prashad, and we're just going to keep doing it. But that's something that sprung out of this visual experience of watching films. We're like, hey, why don't we start a book club also? But It's a fair question. There's another side to this story is whenever a socialist does manage to capture and form a new state, many times they have clamped down on free expression of art, right? And that's a whole other sticky conversation. Like,
For sure.
but don't forget, Hollywood also had to be. It went through the Hays Code. There was a censor in house, the guy that like gave rubber stamp or not. So we think of the U.S. as being absent of that kind of oversight, but no, it also had it. We shouldn't forget that, and to this day, it has it in economic terms. Like people will just veto a project because. But anyway, there's a lot to say about all of those.
Oh yeah.
No, that's great.
I mean, it's a very valid question because that is something I think all the time too. We are in such times, the heights of consumer capitalism, where it's like, I I saw this movie and I'm fine. Like, I've done my mental exercise of thinking radically. But I don't know. I'm always thinking about material action. So, and one of the things is that when it comes to resistance or building radical thought, it's a very continued process. Something Paulo Freire has talked about, that how can education in itself be liberatory? That how can we can ensure that the people, the masses, are creating their own things. So maybe a simple answer is like, make movies, don't even worry about quality. Have a camera, start thinking about your communities, go and start talking to people, okay, and see what emerges out of it. Secondly, be in communication globally. I don't think that just, we can become very intertextual after a while. We are just thinking in within our boundaries or thinking within our text. Like, breaking boundaries is so important. Like, really, really think about, um, you know, as you said, watching global cinema, right? Yeah, let's think about global cinema. Let's think what is happening, but make it also very action oriented. Okay, we have done this, we have watched this movie, what are we going to do? And this is something Jason and I always talk about, because I'm a natural skeptic a lot of times, but I'm like, okay, I want to think about, what are we trying to get out of this? Is it only for educational purposes? Like, how, because I think of myself as a conscious raising educator. I was like, what does that mean? I'm teaching people for 4 months. After that, no consciousness is being raised. So how can we really keep that happening? And how can we really stay grounded and maybe, connected very well on the ground with the community? So I don't think I have an answer to that, but I do agree with Jason that that is something which is a constant thought that we should be having. Like, being on this podcast, talking to you guys, and carrying these conversations forward, and thinking about what does that mean? What does that mean? That material action.
Definitely. I think something that I encourage people with is if you're reading or you're watching something and something moves you, or you even think that's a good idea or that something that's powerful, think real quick, what's stopping you from being part of something like that? And nothing, if you see some kind of educational event that is depicted in a book, or someone talk about, oh, these socialists went out and they knocked doors and they agitated and they managed to turn out this many, and people were like, wow, it was so cool when whoever did that or whatever it was. Um, think about what you are capable of doing in your circumstances with your community and how you can build toward those things, because it's a history, it's living, and all these things are done by human beings, unlike the sort of Hollywood, how Hollywood likes to depict it. The actors of history, none of them are gods, none of them are shining, very few of them have perfect eight packs and no blemishes on their face. They're people who make history happen, and so are we.
Exactly.
I will say, like, not to pat ourselves on the back, but we're new to Atlanta. We haven't even been here 2 years. So we started this project after we'd been in Atlanta like 7 months.
June 20
So 7 or 8
2024
months, we
June.
were still new. And so we've
Yeah.
actually gotten to know this city and the communities here through this project.
Hmm.
And so that's why if you haven't seen us around, we haven't been here that long.
Oh yeah.
Uh, so
Well,
it's been a
Atlanta's
great.
got its own interesting artistic and film tradition. Plenty to talk about there for another
Absolutely.
time, probably.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Anyway,
Da- Lenore, do you? I think you had a final thought, and then I wanted to close it out with something here.
No, I mean what you're saying about don't hesitate to interrogate what moves you in a film is very very true, because it's easy to forget. It's easy to let this fall by the wayside in an era of streaming where you can choose, within certain constraints of streaming services, you can choose the time and place that you interact with something. But film and experiencing these stories in any medium, it's fundamentally a communitarian thing, whether you're in your home watching a stream or whether you're out in a theater watching it with a crowd, because you have the reaction of the crowd to gauge your experience against. You have the your reaction of you and your friends to unpack what you've just seen, um, and lean into that and see where that takes you. No, absolutely, because it doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Absolutely. And if you're watching, sorry to bother you, and you think it's cool that Stephen Yoon's organizing a strike against the phone company, then organize a strike. If you're watching Battle of Algiers, I'll leave it off there.
I mean, you have an incredible,
That's
anecdote, Jacob, about talking to dudes at Landmark Midtown, after seeing the encampments, right? And it's like, yeah, these people are like, yeah, I literally didn't know that this huge revolutionary movement was happening. Like, that's how these things are disseminated, and who knows what the next step might be.
Well, folks, we really appreciate y'all both coming on. I really wanted real quick here, if y'all have any final thoughts, and also to tell us about y'all's individual podcasts as we wrap up here.
Well, thanks for having us on. Cold War Cinema we're coming up on a year and a half of this project too. And it's about films that are in conversation with the Cold War in one way or another, but we're looking at the early years of the Cold War. So late 40s through the 50s into the 60s. So far, we haven't gone past 1960. And we're looking at both the ways that the U.S. was manufacturing consent for the Cold War itself by demonizing socialist countries. This season, we're kind of doing this dialectical thing where we're looking at an anti-communist Hollywood film, and then the next episode looking at a Soviet film, and then back to Hollywood, then back to Soviet for this season. Last season was all films made by left-wing Hollywood people who were blacklisted, and they were kind of injecting leftist themes into these movies. And we discussed some of the cultural and political historical context and discuss the themes of the film. It's been a lot of fun, and we're gonna branch out into global cinema next season, and it's gonna be. We have a lot of interesting people lined up to come on, including radical left filmmakers, things like that.
Fantastic.
Ankita.
Oh, it's
It's
me?
you.
Okay. So, my podcast, The Desi Gaze, basically deals with kind of forgotten, overlooked Hindi films. But not only Hindi films, sometimes we cater to more films beyond the Hindi language. And we have covered, I think, we are on our seventh episode. I'm sorry, I forgot. But we have done uh, many films. Mirch Masala was one of them. Ketan Mehta's Bhavni Bhavai was one of them. One film we did recently was Aranyak, which kind of forgotten, but a very important film in thinking about capitalist consumerism through the theme of cannibalism. I co-host this podcast with my very good friend Azhar, who is a PhD scholar right now, and that's what we are trying to do, just make people think about what Hindi cinema was, how revolutionary it was in its time, and which is and we are also doing this because there is so much hyper nationalist CGI generated movies these days from Bollywood. So I'm also like, okay, let's not forget about this. But our next film that we are discussing is called Damul, which in English means bonded until death. It is based on a short story from Bihar, the place I was born into, and it is about um, caste and casteist labor, directed by Prakash Shah. So I'm very excited to discuss that. But yeah, that's all we do. Like kind of thinking about radical, revolutionary, forgotten, socialist revolutionary cinema from India.
Fantastic. Well, thank y'all both so much one more time. And Lenore, you got any final thoughts before I close this one out here?
Just a book recommendation, Aragnac about capitalism and cannibalism, where that intersects. Again, Tender as the Flesh, very different, very, very similar subject. That might be one for the book club.
That's a
Wow.
great
Tender
one.
is the flesh. Oh, okay.
Agustina Basterica,
Yeah.
also an Argentinian.
That's
All-timer
amazing.
right there.
Yeah.
That's a heck of a book right there.
Yeah.
Well, we appreciate you folks. So everybody's got 2 pieces of homework. The first one is to pre-order my dadgum book.
I'm,
When this
I'm gonna
goes
pre
out.
I'm gonna pre-order it. I
Heck
really
yeah.
appreciate you.
Yeah.
Heck yeah.
That's a big accomplishment, man.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
And the
Exactly.
second piece of homework is go watch a revolutionary movie. Everyone who's listening to this, go watch it.
I'll
You
vouch
can
your
pick your
support.
own, but pick something good. You know, and we're not talking. You can watch something about the Black Panthers, but not Black Panther or Black Panther 2. And
Exactly.
I literally
Just listen to James Baldwin speak. Go on YouTube.
let's
That's
do it. Yeah.
enough.
I saw somebody the other day. They were joking. They were like, "I came out of the theater and I was like, that had nothing to do with Huey and being." All right, folks, y'all have a good one.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to Socialist Shelf Radio.